In the final years of World War II, thousands of German soldiers found themselves facing a reality they had never imagined, surrendering not to the harsh winters of Russia or the chaos of the Eastern Front, but to the soldiers of the United States. Many expected the worst. They had been told that the Americans were brutal, that capture meant humiliation or starvation. But what awaited them was something far different, and for many deeply unsettling. When the first columns of German prisoners were marched into the American lines in North Africa and later across Europe, they were exhausted, hungry, and fearful. Their minds were filled with propaganda, visions of cruelty, forced labor, and vengeance. Instead, the Americans offered food, not stale bread or scraps, but full meals, hot coffee, stew, and cigarettes. It wasn't kindness they understood, it was confusion. One German private later wrote, "We expected fists. We were given soup in the desert camps of Tunisia. U.S. Army officers enforced the Geneva Convention with precision. Every prisoner was registered, given medical treatment, and provided rations nearly identical to those of American soldiers. For men raised under the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht, it was an alien experience. There was no shouting, no beating, no public shaming. Even captured officers were treated with formality and respect." At first, the Germans thought it was a trick, a clever ploy to win their cooperation. But the days passed, then weeks, and the pattern never changed. They were fed, clothed, and sheltered. Some guards even joked with them, asking about home or offering them cigarettes. The prisoners didn't laugh back. Not yet. They simply couldn't understand how an enemy could show mercy. The contrast was stark. These were men who had grown up in a system that glorified domination and feared weakness. Their nation had preached that compassion was for the defeated. And now in defeat, they were being shown compassion by the very people they were told were decadent, inferior, and weak. In one report from the U.S. War Department, an intelligence officer noted, "Many of the German prisoners appear bewildered by humane treatment. They cannot reconcile it with their training." It was only the beginning of a revelation that would spread across thousands of POW camps, both in Europe and across the ocean in America. A revelation that would quietly reshape how these men saw the world and themselves. By late 1943, the first ships carrying German prisoners of war began crossing the Atlantic. Their destination was not a battlefield or a prison in the traditional sense. It was the American heartland. The United States had built hundreds of POW camps across the country, from the pine forests of Georgia to the open plains of Kansas. For most of these soldiers, it was the first time they had ever seen America, and what they saw defied everything they had been taught. As the trains rolled inland, the prisoners stared out the windows. Instead of ruins and bombed cities, they saw endless fields, new factories, and towns untouched by war. Children waved at the passing convoys. Farmers stood by fences, curious but not hostile. The Germans sat in silence. They had been told the Allies were collapsing under their own chaos. Yet America looked stronger than ever. When the trains stopped, the prisoners stepped into a different kind of captivity. Their camps were surrounded by barbed wire, yes, but inside, life was surprisingly structured and humane. Each man received a bed, a uniform, and access to clean water. They were issued work clothes and assigned to daily tasks: farming, carpentry, or even assisting with factory production. Every morning began with roll call and breakfast. The food, plentiful, varied, and hot, shocked them most of all. POWs were served meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee, sometimes even dessert. Many could not believe it. "We eat better here than our families in Germany," one soldier wrote home. The American guards, for the most part, treated them with professionalism. Orders were given, but not screamed. Discipline existed, but without humiliation. And when punishments were issued, they followed clear rules, not the unpredictable cruelty the Germans themselves had inflicted on Soviet captives. Letters from the camp soon began reaching Germany through the Red Cross. They described the same strange reality, a captivity where men could rest, read, even learn English. Families back home often refused to believe the words were true. They assumed the letters were censored propaganda. But they weren't. For many of the German POWs, this treatment planted the first seeds of doubt, not in their enemy's strength, but in their own beliefs. If the Americans could win a world war and still treat their prisoners with dignity, then maybe the ideals of the Reich, fear, obedience, and hatred, were weaker than they had been told. In those camps, surrounded by the vast quiet of the American landscape, German soldiers began to realize something that would haunt them long after the war, that true strength did not come from brutality. It came from restraint, and that realization was only beginning to take hold. In the American prisoner of war camps, daily life followed a rhythm, not of punishment, but of order. The Germans woke early, lined up for roll call, and ate breakfast together in long wooden halls. There was no shouting, no chaos, no fear. For many of them, it was the first time in years they had experienced predictability, something that, ironically, felt like peace. The food continued to surprise them. Steaming trays of oatmeal, eggs, toast, and coffee were served every morning. At midday, there were stews, meatloaf, vegetables, and fruit. The Germans, used to rationing and shortages at home, could hardly believe it. Some even refused to eat at first, thinking it was a trick. But when the meals kept coming, day after day, the disbelief turned to something else: respect. Letters and diaries from captured soldiers spoke of this strange new reality. One wrote, "It is hard to hate those who feed you." Another, once a fervent Nazi youth leader, admitted, "Our officers told us that Americans were weak and selfish. Yet here, even the guards eat the same food we do. That is not weakness. That is fairness." Work was part of every day, too. Many prisoners were sent to nearby farms to harvest crops, build fences, or repair barns. Others worked in sawmills or canning plants, earning small wages they could spend in camp stores. What astonished them most was how willingly Americans cooperated with their former enemies. Local farmers brought food, shared cigarettes, even joked with the men who, only months before, had fought against their sons in Europe. In the fields of Iowa, Kansas, and Texas, something remarkable happened. Trust began to replace suspicion. Prisoners worked side by side with civilians, under minimal guard, and almost none tried to escape. They had no reason to. The war was far away, and the people around them treated them as men, not monsters. One farmer's wife later wrote in her diary, "They worked hard, polite and quiet. You could see in their eyes that they were tired of fighting. We gave them lemonade, and they thanked us." In broken English, but with sincerity. To many Germans, these simple acts of kindness were more shocking than any military defeat. They had been raised on propaganda that portrayed the Allies as barbaric. Yet here in the middle of America, strangers offered them hospitality, patience, and dignity. Some German officers tried to keep discipline alive, enforcing the old hierarchy, salutes, ranks, and ideological lectures. But even that began to crumble. The longer the prisoners stayed, the more they saw that equality, not fear, governed American life. In the mess halls, the guards and prisoners ate the same food. In the work camps, they shared the same sun and sweat. A few began to wonder, what if this was the world Germany had been trying to destroy? For the first time, the soldiers who once believed themselves superior began to learn humility, not through defeat, but through compassion. And that perhaps was the Allies' most powerful victory of all. By the spring of 1945, German prisoners across America had settled into a strange kind of peace. Behind the barbed wire, they built gardens, painted murals, and played soccer in open fields. For men who had spent years surrounded by destruction, the order and calm of captivity felt unreal. Some even began to forget they were prisoners. At Camp Algona in Iowa, a POW artist painted vast frescoes on the walls of the chapel, scenes of hope, family, and faith. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, others wrote newspapers, staged plays, and studied English. They learned carpentry, mechanics, even philosophy. The Americans encouraged it all, believing that education and work would do more to change hearts than punishment ever could. The U.S. Army called it re-education, though it was not forced. There were no lectures on democracy or propaganda films, only access to truth. The camps had libraries filled with translated American newspapers, history books, and novels. Many German POWs read them eagerly, searching for answers to questions they had never dared to ask. One prisoner later said, It was the first time we learned about our own war from another side. It made me feel ashamed, but also free back home. Their families starved under Allied blockades. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin lay in ruins. Letters from Germany spoke of hunger, bombings, and loss. But in America, the men who had once fought for Hitler were gaining weight, learning trades, and discovering ideas that had been banned in their homeland. That contrast haunted them. Some wrote to their families, urging them to prepare for a new kind of Germany, one built not on pride, but on cooperation. One diary entry from a camp in Georgia read simply, "I used to believe victory was proof of superiority. Now I believe decency is proof of strength." The Americans didn't hide their way of life. They let the prisoners see it, the factories, the farms, the simple comfort of a society that worked because its people trusted one another. German engineers were stunned by American organization. Even a small rural town could produce more food and material than entire divisions back home. One captured officer from the Africa Corps, once proud of German efficiency, admitted, "We thought they were soft, but their strength is invisible. It's in their unity." Every day, the prisoners saw the difference between dictatorship and democracy, not through speeches, but through meals, fairness, and the quiet rhythm of work. They realized that the Americans did not win through cruelty or chaos. They won through structure, compassion, and the will to share. For many, it was the first time they had seen a world where power didn't demand fear. At night, as the guards switched off the floodlights, many prisoners lay awake, staring through the barbed wire at the vast American sky. They had come as conquerors, fallen as captives, and were leaving as witnesses to something they could never have imagined: mercy and victory. And that quiet mercy was reshaping them more deeply than defeat ever could. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead, the Reich had fallen, but across America, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners remained behind barbed wire, waiting, working, and thinking. For them, time had slowed, yet life continued with surprising normalcy. At Camp Atterbury in Indiana, prisoners baked bread for both soldiers and civilians. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, they harvested crops under the blazing southern sun. Some even worked in factories helping to repair American vehicles or sort lumber for local construction. They were paid modestly, in canteen tokens rather than cash. But for men who had once lived in trenches, it felt like a kind of dignity. The work gave them purpose. The fairness gave them pause. The Americans were not obligated to be generous. Many of these men had fought bitterly, some had killed Allied soldiers, and yet they were treated with respect. Hot meals, medical care, and even cigarettes were provided. One guard at Camp Swift in Texas wrote in his journal, "I look at these boys, 19, 20, maybe 22, and I think they were told we were monsters. Now they see we're just men." The German prisoners began to change, not out of fear, but through observation. They watched how their guards worked together, how Americans spoke freely without fear of punishment. They saw order without oppression, authority without brutality. Many began to question everything they had been taught. They asked about democracy, freedom of speech, and even the U.S. Constitution. For the first time, they were allowed to speak their minds, and no one silenced them. A prisoner later said, "They conquered us with bread and fairness, not bombs." But guilt lingered. News from home grew worse each week. Germany was in ruins, divided, starving. Families wrote letters begging their sons to stay strong. Some prisoners felt shame knowing they ate well while their mothers went hungry. Others resolved to bring something good home. Not material goods, but lessons. One POW at Camp Algona wrote to his wife, "We lost the war because we built walls around our minds. Here I have learned what happens when a nation tears them down." The camp newspapers, written and edited by the prisoners, became centers of discussion. Articles debated politics, economics, and ethics. Some even published essays on rebuilding Germany after the war. The tone had changed. Pride was gone. In its place was humility and a quiet desire to start again. Even American officers noticed it. One report from 1945 read, The majority of POWs no longer show hostility. They show curiosity. They wish to understand. In the evenings when work was done, the camps felt like small towns, filled with music, writing, and reflection. The laughter that once mocked the enemy had turned inward, softened by understanding. It was during these long, quiet months that many German soldiers began to see the future, not as a continuation of their past, but as something new. They had come to America as soldiers of a fallen empire, but in captivity, surrounded by kindness they had never expected, they began to see what true strength looked like. One POW summed it up best in a letter home. "We thought we were the civilized ones, but in their victory, the Americans showed us what civilization truly is." By the autumn of 1945, America's German prisoner of war camps had become something no one had expected. Places of transformation. The war was over, but the lessons of defeat were still unfolding. The soldiers who had once marched across Europe now marched to fields, workshops, and classrooms under a different kind of discipline, one not enforced by fear, but by order and fairness. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, German POWs built model towns to study architecture. In Camp Hearn, Texas, they painted murals and staged classical plays. And at Fort Devens in Massachusetts, some studied English and American civics under supervision from university professors. What began as captivity had quietly turned into education. The Americans encouraged this transformation. They believed that Germany's future and the world's peace depended on changing how these men thought. Through books, discussions, and even films, they showed the prisoners what democracy looked like. For many Germans, it was their first encounter with a system that treated dissent not as treason, but as a right. One prisoner later wrote, "They did not preach. They simply lived their ideas, and that spoke louder than any speech." At night, the camps glowed faintly with electric light, a luxury most German cities no longer had. The men would gather outside the barracks, smoking and talking quietly under the stars. The conversations always circled back to the same question: what went wrong? They realized that their defeat was not just military, it was moral, industrial, and ideological. The Americans had fought with a unity Germany had never known, a nation of workers, farmers, and engineers, all contributing to the same goal. A former German sergeant later confessed, "They beat us because they believed in something larger than themselves. We only believed in orders." The German officers found this revelation harder to accept. Many clung to old pride, dismissing the Americans as lucky or unrefined. But even they couldn't deny what they saw every day: discipline without brutality, authority without corruption, and power used with restraint. For men raised in a regime where violence enforced loyalty, this was unsettling. Some resisted the realization, others surrendered to it. In one camp report, a guard noted, "The older officers remain defiant, but the younger men, they have changed. They ask questions now, not orders." Letters home carried that quiet change across the ocean. "America is vast," one wrote. "They do not fear ideas. They let people speak freely. It is strange, but it works." Another told his family, "We lost the war because we did not understand our enemy. They are not weak. They are strong because they share their strength." The irony was inescapable. The same soldiers who had once laughed at Allied softness were now learning from it. They began to see that compassion was not weakness, it was endurance. The Americans didn't have to break their enemies to prove victory. They showed mercy instead, and that mercy began reshaping the hearts of men who had once sworn loyalty to tyranny. In the months that followed, thousands of these men would begin to prepare for their return home. They would go back to a Germany in ruins, but they would not return unchanged. For many, the real rebuilding had already begun, not in the streets of Berlin or Cologne, but in the quiet barracks of America. By early 1946, the war had been over for months, but inside the American POW camps, the transformation continued. The barbed wire still stood, the guards still made their rounds, but the tension was gone. The Germans were no longer prisoners of hatred. They were students of a new world. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the mornings began with work details: cutting lumber, repairing fences, or tending crops. But in the evenings, the barracks turned into classrooms. German soldiers sat at wooden tables learning English, reading newspapers, and writing essays about democracy. The same men who once shouted Nazi slogans now debated the meaning of freedom of speech. It was part of a program the Americans called re-education. Officially, it aimed to prepare POWs for peaceful reintegration. Unofficially, it was a quiet revolution. The United States Army believed that to rebuild Europe, it had to begin with the minds of its former enemies. They distributed books about history, economics, and American government. They screened films about life in the United States, not propaganda, but glimpses of ordinary people. Families shopping, farmers harvesting, children at school. For many Germans, it was their first time seeing a society where freedom wasn't chaos. It was order through trust. The change wasn't immediate, but it was visible. The men began to speak differently, even think differently. They no longer compared everything to the Reich. They compared it to America. One former Luftwaffe mechanic wrote in his journal, "We were told they were decadent, but I see now they are disciplined without cruelty, proud without arrogance. They work as a nation, not as a hierarchy." For men raised in a system built on submission, this realization was staggering. Life in the camps had its hardships, but compared to the devastation back home, it felt like another world. The prisoners received consistent food, medical care, and humane treatment, luxuries unknown in post-war Germany. Letters from families described hunger and cold, cities in ruins, and children scavenging for bread. For some, that knowledge was unbearable. Others felt shame, but many saw it as a responsibility to take what they had learned and bring it home. A POW at Camp Breckenridge wrote, "Here I have seen the enemy feed me and treat me as a man. When I return, I will not forget that mercy is stronger than hate." Not everyone welcomed the change. In some camps, die-hard Nazi officers tried to enforce old discipline, punishing anyone who spoke favorably of America. They called them traitors of the Reich. But by 1946, their power had faded. The majority no longer feared them. The tide had turned, not through violence, but through example. As one American officer observed, "We didn't beat them with guns. We beat them with fairness." The guards themselves noticed the transformation. They remembered the early days, when the Germans looked at them with suspicion and resentment. Now they greeted them with respect, sometimes even friendship. Some played baseball together. Others traded small gifts, cigarettes, carved wood, sketches, or songs. In those moments, the war felt distant, almost unreal. The men who once fought across oceans now shared the same sunlight, the same food, the same jokes. But beyond the fences, the world was changing fast. Germany was divided. Cities were being rebuilt under Allied supervision, and soon the prisoners would be sent back to a homeland they no longer fully recognized. Many dreaded it. Others were eager, but all knew that something within them had changed forever. One letter, found years later in a German archive, said it best: "We entered this war thinking we were the superior race, but we are leaving these camps having learned what true superiority is: compassion." The laughter of arrogance had long faded. What remained was understanding, born not from defeat, but from dignity. By the summer of 1946, German prisoners across America began to feel the world shifting beneath their feet. They had arrived as enemies, soldiers of a fallen Reich, but now many were workers, students, even friends. The war was over, yet something deeper was taking place, a quiet exchange of values. At Camp Algona in Iowa, prisoners who once built fortifications for war were now building barns and repairing roads. They worked beside American civilians, farmers, mechanics, carpenters, men who treated them not as captives, but as equals. The wages were small, but the respect was immense. One prisoner later recalled, "They did not curse us. They thanked us." That was harder to bear than hatred. Every day was filled with small revelations. The German soldiers, raised to believe that strength was measured in domination, discovered that in America, it was measured in cooperation. They watched how Americans argued with their superiors without fear, how workers spoke directly to officers, how orders were debated, not obeyed blindly. For men trained under absolute hierarchy, This freedom felt alien and inspiring. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, one officer wrote in his notebook, "Here, no one fears authority, yet everything functions. It is discipline without tyranny." The Americans, too, learned something. Many had expected the prisoners to be cruel, arrogant, or fanatical. But as months passed, they saw them as young men, weary, proud, but human. Some were barely 20, caught in a war they hadn't chosen. Guards and POWs began to exchange gifts, carved trinkets, drawings, and even music. German prisoners formed orchestras, playing Beethoven and Bach under the American sky. Locals from nearby towns came to listen, sitting quietly as men who once fought them filled the air with music. For many Germans, that applause was a revelation. It wasn't forced, it wasn't fear, it was respect, genuine and human. One violinist later said, "That night I felt free for the first time in years. Not because the gates were open, but because someone heard me as a man, not an enemy." In that moment, the fences seemed smaller. Evenings in the camps often ended in quiet conversation. Some Germans asked the guards about life in America, the elections, the newspapers, the factories. They were amazed that ordinary citizens could criticize the government openly and not be punished. They began to understand that democracy was not chaos, it was confidence. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, a guard once explained to a prisoner how American elections worked. The man listened silently, then said, "In our country, we could never imagine such trust. You believe your people will choose wisely." The guard smiled and answered, "We have to." Letters home grew longer, more thoughtful. Instead of describing food or work, prisoners wrote about ideas, fairness, freedom, equality. Many confessed confusion, even guilt over what they had believed before. They began to see that power built on fear was fragile, but power built on respect endured. One letter read, "They feed us, clothe us, and treat us as men." I start to wonder, were we ever truly free when we served our own leaders? Not all could accept this. Some clung to the old ideals, refusing to believe their enemy could be honorable. But for most, the experience left an indelible mark. They realized that victory was not just about conquering territory, it was about conquering hearts. And in that quiet war, America had already won. By the end of that summer, news spread that repatriation would soon begin. Men who had lived behind fences for years began to prepare for the journey home. Some were eager to see their families. Others feared what they would find in a broken Germany. But one thing united them, the feeling that they were leaving not as prisoners, but as witnesses. They had seen a world where strength meant compassion and where mercy was a weapon more powerful than any gun. And that realization, more than freedom itself, was what they would carry home. By early 1947, the repatriation of German prisoners of war was in full motion. Across the United States, thousands lined up for processing. Their uniforms faded, their faces leaner, wiser. They carried small duffel bags filled with keepsakes, letters from guards, handmade carvings, and sometimes photographs taken in a land they had once called the enemy's. At Camp Shanks in New York, trains arrived daily, filled with men bound for the ships that would carry them home. For many, the journey was bittersweet. The fences they had once hated now felt strangely safe. Beyond them waited an uncertain Germany, a homeland they no longer recognized. One prisoner later wrote, "I left America behind barbed wire, but I felt freer there than I ever did in uniform." As the ships departed for Europe, American guards stood on the docks, watching in silence. Some saluted, others simply waved. They had spent years together, as captor and captive. Yet by the end, the line between them had blurred. A U.S. sergeant at the port of New Orleans said, "They came here as Nazis. Most are leaving as men." For many Germans aboard those ships, the memories of camp life, the work, the meals, the small acts of kindness became more than comfort. They became lessons. When the first ships reached Bremen and Hamburg, the returning POWs stepped onto a homeland that felt foreign. The cities lay in ruins. Streets once alive with parades and pride were now silent paths of rubble. Families searched for bread, for shelter, for hope. Those who had lived through the captivity in America began to see the contrast more clearly than ever. They had left a land of abundance, of order, of fairness, and returned to one struggling to rebuild itself from ashes. In letters and interviews years later, many spoke of the shock. One man said, "We expected America to humiliate us. Instead, they showed us how a nation treats people, even its enemies." That was their victory. The Allies had promised to return the prisoners humanely, and they kept that promise. Each man received rations, medical care, and a final pay allowance. But as they re-entered post-war Germany, many found their old friends and families skeptical. Some accused them of being Americanized, of forgetting the pride of the fatherland. To this, one former sergeant replied, "I did not forget Germany. I just learned what it could have been." In the years that followed, many of those former POWs became quiet voices for change. They carried with them memories of fairness and decency, of being treated as humans when the world had called them monsters. When post-war Germany began to rebuild, some of these men joined efforts to promote democracy, education, and cooperation with the West. One of them, a teacher from Saxony, would later tell his students, "The Americans did not win by bombs alone. They won by showing us that mercy is stronger than hate." Historians would later trace a subtle influence from those returning POWs. They were among the first Germans to experience democratic values firsthand, to see that freedom didn't mean chaos, compassion didn't mean weakness. In the factories, the schools, and even the churches, they carried these lessons quietly, shaping a new generation that would refuse to repeat the mistakes of the past. One historian called them the seeds of the Federal Republic. Men who brought back not ideology, but perspective. But for the men themselves, the memories were personal. They remembered the guards who shared coffee, the farmers who treated them kindly, the nights spent under wide, peaceful skies. To them, America was no longer an enemy. It was a mirror, showing what humanity could look like when pride was stripped away. One prisoner summed it up simply: "We came as soldiers of a fallen empire. We left as witnesses of another kind of strength, and as those men stepped back into their homeland, carrying stories few could believe, they brought with them something rarer than victory: understanding." By the early 1950s, the war was over in every visible sense. The ruins were being rebuilt, the fields were green again, and a new Germany was beginning to rise, one humbled, scarred, but determined to move forward. Yet among the millions who worked to rebuild it were men who carried a memory unlike any other. The memory of captivity in a foreign land that had shown them decency when they least expected it. These were the former German prisoners of war, who had once looked at America with suspicion and hatred, and who now spoke of it with respect, even gratitude. For years after their return, those men were quiet about what they had seen. In post-war Germany, no one wanted to hear stories that humanized the enemy. Yet slowly, through memoirs, interviews, and classroom lessons, the truth emerged. The United States had not only captured German soldiers, it had, in a quiet way, re-educated them through humanity. In the camps of Texas, Kansas, and Georgia, they had learned discipline without cruelty, order without oppression, and kindness without weakness. It was a strange education, taught not in classrooms, but in kitchens, fields, and workshops. One former prisoner said, "They didn't tell us democracy was better, they showed us." Historians now recognize that these experiences played a subtle but powerful role in shaping post-war German identity. Thousands of returning POWs carried with them first-hand examples of American values: fairness, respect, and the belief that even in defeat, a man's dignity could be preserved. These values would quietly blend into the social and political rebirth of West Germany, into its constitution, its education, its approach to freedom. The men who once wore the uniforms of the Reich became citizens of a democracy that would become one of America's strongest allies. As one historian wrote decades later, the POWs returned not only with memories of captivity, but with lessons in liberty. For many of those former soldiers, the legacy of their time in American camps lasted a lifetime. Some kept in touch with their former guards, exchanging Christmas cards for decades. Others returned to America as tourists, standing on the soil where they had once stood behind barbed wire. One man visiting a former campsite in Oklahoma placed a small wooden cross in the ground. On it, he had written, "Here I learned to be human again." The story of the German POWs in America is not a tale of victory or revenge. It is a story of transformation. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of war, there can be light, found not in weapons or flags, but in simple acts of decency. When the Germans arrived in the camps, they expected humiliation. Instead, they found structure, fairness, and food, given not out of pity, but principle. It was a lesson that no ideology could erase. And when they left, many carried with them a quiet conviction that the true measure of power lies not in domination, but in compassion. Decades later, when journalists interviewed these men, many spoke with the same tone, one of astonishment, humility, and gratitude. They no longer saw their captivity as punishment, but as awakening. One said, "America defeated us in war, but it also saved us from ourselves." The story of the German POWs in America is a reminder that wars may be fought with bombs and guns, but peace is built with choices. Choices to feed, to forgive, to treat one's enemy not as a monster but as a man. And for those who lived it, the soldiers who came to America in chains and left as free men, that lesson became their greatest inheritance. They had seen the best of their enemy, and in that, they discovered the best of humanity. The war ended long ago, but the memory of that kindness endures, a quiet echo of the truth that mercy, even in war, can change the world. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.